Welcome back to the Sounds of the Baskerville. I'm James Flaherty. I'm here with the great man himself, Chris Baskerville. How are you, Chris?
Good morning, James. Good to be back.
It's great to have you. You've been very busy, and that brings to mind a kind of a Churchill quote. Something about if you leave a problem, it gets worse. What it was, we've talked about it in previous episodes, but lay it on me again.
I'll paraphrase the great man.
Can you? Yeah.
Which is, if you see danger coming and you meet that danger head on, the danger will halve. But if you ignore it, the danger will double.
So we've implored the director, the advisor, to listen to these podcasts, to see if there's some little lessons or little gems in them. The question, though, is that person, like all of the other people who are advisors to the business in distress, they have implored directors during COVID and all that stuff, act now. Do something now.
Meet the danger head on.
But we're Australian in this room, and the people listening in and those from overseas, there might be a little bit of Australian in lots of us, which is, if I can just kick that can down the road.
Or it's more, she'll be right.
She'll be right, mate.
Something will happen that'll make it all happen.
And funnily enough, did happen where the government changed the law a little bit to allow a thing called Small Business Reconstruction. So in a sense, something did come along which did change the potential for a director who's got a big debt, but what on the face of it looks a pretty good business, and he or she wants to keep employing their staff. So for once in the life of the struggling director, something did come along, and it did change. But go back to the previous advice, it's not going to be something, as far as I can see, is going to stay like it is. Now what are we talking about? We're talking about small business reconstruction, aren't we, Chris?
Yeah, small business restructuring was invented or put together during the sort of pandemic years. I think it was in 2020. And the idea behind it and why they call it small business restructuring is because the government had to look at all the data of what makes up the bulk of the liquidations in Australia, and it's typically a small business with less than 10 employees that owes about $1 million. So they said, well, that's the market that's most likely to be impacted with economic recessions and cycles and disruption. So then they said, well, there was plenty of advocates out there. I think there's some small business groups that were advocating, and I think in the insolvency profession, we've got some peak bodies that were also advocating and basically said to government, look, you need to come up with a mechanism to save small business. And small business accounts for the majority of employees, I believe, in Australia is all small business. So in other words, we need to save those that can save others, So in comes small business restructuring, and it is designed for businesses with less than $1 million worth of debt who have made sure they've paid all their employee entitlements in full, and I mean to the cent. And it is designed to keep the director in control of the business and ideally to keep employment going. So in other words, it's designed to keep the business moving forward with the director in control and with some assistance from appropriately qualified experts.
Who has seen it all before? Insolvency practitioners such as yourself who've got experience in restructuring and voluntary administrations and steering people out of the wilderness as opposed to just shutting them down and selling off the assets. So, wow, okay, this new thing came along and, a bit of a slow start. People kind of said, well, hang on, how many companies have got all their stuff paid up? How does that ever happen?
Well, I'll be honest, James. As soon as we heard that one of the two critical qualifying criteria, debt's less than $1 million, and all employees paid in full, as in what is due and payable, I laughed and said, oh, well, no one's going to qualify for that, because it's quite often in a liquidation or an administration that the number one employee entitlement that has not been paid is superannuation. I could go through my list of more than 1,500 companies or so that I've seen. Superannuation is generally always there as a debt.
And you go, hang on, well, so this is...
No one's going to qualify.
Then we go back to, well, it's a good business. If you've got a good business and it's just taken a massive hit, but you're trying to do the right thing. Doing the right thing includes paying the superannuation of your employees, trying to pay the PAYG and the GST. And also, don't forget, as a director, you're on the hook for them if you don't pay for them anyway. So there's an extra incentive.
Yeah,
so they stuck that little one in at the same time. Thanks for that. So if I said there and said, well, hang on, I've run up all these debts. I went to somebody and said, how much will you charge me to make this all go away?
Yeah, well, this is the other cool part about the small business restructuring, the way it's legislated, is we as small business restructuring practitioners, all registered liquidators are qualified for, is we fix a fee to take the job on right from the beginning up until the date that the proposal is then sent out to creditors. So there's a bit of a month's worth of work involved in there. There's reports we need to put together, and then we get it out to creditors to consider the proposal. And then we fix a fee. So that's the front end. We fix a fee there. And that's usually paid by the director up front. But then the second part of how we get paid is it has to be a fixed percentage of the fund we get out to creditors. So in other words, let's just say 10% as an example.
Yeah.
So, loosely, if we have $100,000 there to get to creditors and we take a 10% that falls in there, it's roughly about, a $9,000 odd to the restructuring practitioner and about $90,000 going out to creditors. That's the general bush maths about it, but it has to be a fixed fee of what actually goes to creditors.
I could say, well, if I got a deal for you, I could, I've got $700,000. I can, for X grand, I can cut a deal with all of them, and you'll be scot-free. Yeah,
but when you look at it, because of the fixed component of the fee up front and the fixed percentage of the fund that is distributed to creditors, and when you think about that, this only applies to businesses with less than $1 million worth of debt.
Yeah, gotcha.
Right? Then what ends up happening is, if you look at it at a very basic maths level, you're helping a business get rid of some of their legacy debt for a fixed fee. And that legacy debt could be a couple of $100,000, could be more than that. So if you look at it from the director's perspective, they sort of do the maths in their way and go, well, hang on, if this is the amount of money you're going to save me for this fixed fee, they do the maths and go, well, that makes sense.
That's right. So that all sounds like a great deal. Buy now and save. So there's a couple of things that come to mind is, well, for a start, you can't keep doing it. So you can only get one shot.
You get one shot.
You get one shot. So you've got to be pretty legit. The second thing is you have already met all the thresholds, so you can't be a complete chonk and not have paid stuff and disappeared. You've got to be a business. And I think at the end of the day, you're going, as a small business reconstruction practitioner, you would have to go to them and say, this is the deal, and here's why the deal is something that you should accept. So from your perspective and your own role in the profession and your role as a business person, you're not going to go to them with something that's complete baloney. You're going to have to go to them with something that is acceptable for them, aren't you? So it's not as simple as saying, well, I can make this all just shazam go away. You've still got to negotiate with the creditors.
Yeah. There's still a fair whack of work to do. And this is probably the interesting thing about small business restructuring is you get the benefit of a qualified administrator, liquidator, who's now acting with the director. So you're actually on the director's side, helping them negotiate an arrangement with their creditors. Now, why is that unique is because ordinarily with my liquidator hat on, with my administrator hat on, or trustee hat on, right, whichever hat I wear ordinarily, I'm actually on the creditor side. So I've got to look out for what is in the best interest of the creditors. And so sometimes that can conflict with what's in the best interest of the director. But in small business restructuring, we actually get to stand with the director on that, which means we get to also work with their advisors as well. So their accountants, their lawyers, in trying to formulate a proposal.
That is an ideal use of the skills and the knowledge that you've built up over all of these years. An opportunity to actually get in there and help save the director. So in some ways unfettered. Not unfettered by your obligations to the profession, to the law and so forth, but with them on that part of the journey, which is cool. So you've done a few?
Yeah. I've had a couple come my way. One failed and one was successful.
And lessons learned both times.
Yeah, absolutely. Lessons learned both times. I mean, the first one that failed, I totally get what the creditor's position was, is the first one that failed was not trading. It was selling down its assets. It had no employees. So you got to remember, small business restructuring is there to preserve business. preserve employment. So if your business is already shut and the directors have made a decision to sell off their assets and wind down orderly, then I can understand why creditors say, well, why don't you just put it into liquidation or put an administrator in and just follow that process? Because what's there to restructure? Whereas difference with the second one we did, it was an engineering consulting firm. It had 8 full-time employees. The business was continuing to trade. It traded all the way through COVID, albeit at a huge loss in profits. We could show the creditors that, yes, the pandemic negatively impacted this guy, but the data was also showing out of the pandemic, this guy's starting to fly again. So creditors could see, yes, the pandemic has hurt this guy, but he's got a good business. It just, who wants that engineering consulting services when the whole world shut down for 2 years, you know?
And maybe that's the thing. You've got to be in the shoes of the creditor and sit there and go, well, why would I take a haircut for this bunch of directors? So that's the bit about not kicking the can down the road, because these are pretty new and not really many of them happened very much.
Yeah, they brought them in 2020, and I think maybe you could probably count it on just 2 hands. Probably less than 2 hands. How many people took it up? And in fairness to everybody out there, not much education around this. It's all fairly new. Even insolvency practitioners are trying to keep on the front end and go, right, how does this legislation work? Right, so that regulation points to that, and then this one does this. You know, we're even getting our feet as well.
But in fairness to the profession, the great Australian tradition again kicked in, well, no one's chasing me for the cash, so I won't worry about it.
Yeah.
Now that we've talked about the letters of awareness from the tax office, we've talked about the fact that most of the gloves are off, people want their money back, so kicking and screaming, some people, and otherwise proactively.
Director penalty notices have now been modified to say, and this is assuming it is a non-lockdown director penalty notice, which means directors have options if they want to avoid a penalty. You put the company into liquidation, you put the company into administration, or you appoint a small business restructuring practitioner. That is one of your options. And the ATO is forthcoming with that and saying, here are your 3 options if you want to avoid this penalty. So if you did have debts less than $1 million, you paid all your employee entitlements up to date, but the ATO has sent you a notice of that kind, what a perfect time to consider it.
Why act now? What's the advantage of getting into SBRs now? Like, why should I do it now?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was very similar to what we said during the sort of the pandemic lockdown years. We said if you wanted to do a deal with your creditors, now's the time. Because your creditors are going to be responsive. They're going to accept that we're all in this together and what a horrible situation it is for everyone. And so if we look at the opportunity for SBR now, at the moment, if we can show that the pandemic really did have an impact negatively and you've accumulated all this sort of legacy debt, as we say, but your business has got good profits and cash flow, it just needs to deal with this legacy issue. Well, at the moment, directors can say, yep, the pandemic has caused the legacy issue. But as time moves on from here on in, that excuse is going to wane. And people are going to go, mate, you're sort of 1 or 2 years after the pandemic. How can you come to us now and say that the pandemic caused your business disrupted?
Yeah. And hang on, there was so much money washing around from government support. And,
correct.
Yeah, so that doesn't really wash. And by the way, that's quite a nice boat, and you've got there, fella. So
nice jet ski,
or whatever. So I think that's the lesson: is it's new in the sense that people are getting their heads around it. We've talked about too in previous meetings and so forth that you can talk to creditors before the actual deal's put, can't you?
Some of the creditors have been very proactive and they're saying, look, if you want us to give you some feedback on this proposal, why don't you send it to us before the deadline for when the proposal is to go out, and we'll give you some comments. And some of the comments that we've seen, we've then gone to the director and say, this is what your creditors are saying. Would you mind maybe improving the offer before we send it out? And the directors have been accepting of that because they're still ahead. And so the directors have improved their offer. It's gone out to creditors and magically it's been accepted.
So going back to the great man himself, as opposed to this great man, Churchill. You can halve the problem. You can reduce the debt. You can make a substantial reduction in what you owe with the agreement of creditors in the right hands. And now's a good time because it's new. The law is still relatively new. There haven't been people trying to carve bits out or someone saying, well, hang on, there's only 3.5% unemployment. Why are we trying to save jobs? There's all these sorts of, that's still not part of the story. The story is there's a new way that directors can keep in control and get a reset without a black mark against their name.
And you meet the danger head on.
If there is a problem in your business, now is the time to act. Isn't that, Chris?
That is correct.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, James.
See ya. A reminder that these podcasts are general in nature and do not constitute advice, and they don't take into account your personal circumstances. So if you think, though, that some of the issues raised might apply to you, you should seek qualified financial, legal or counselling advice.